In some previous videos, I talked about the third and fourth technological singularity. Some people reached out to me asking what that was, because when they looked it up, they didn't see exactly that associated with what I was mentioning. So they asked me what that was. Well, so I'm going to explain using the paper I published in the journal Nanoethics in 1919 in this special video for 50,000 subscribers of the World Geopolitics channel, where when I started writing it in 2011, I basically took a concept from computer science and mathematics and applied it to anthropology and history. It took me from 2012 to 2018 to write this scientific article because I did it in parallel with my doctoral research, which was on geopolitics and organized crime. So, since it was a computer science topic that I was going to expand with history and anthropology in my free time, although I'm from the humanities field, I've been working with technology for many years, mainly in intelligence and auditing. So, having this connection with new technologies has always been something very important to me. And the arrival of Chat Generative Pre-trained Transformer, which so many people talk about and worry over, didn't really catch me by surprise because something like this was kind of expected even though we didn't know exactly what or when. And obviously, artificial intelligence will have a huge impact on society and, as a consequence, on geopolitics. But the question is, what is the technological singularity? And why is it so important even though it's relatively unknown to the general public? The hypothesis of technological singularities was first formulated by John von Neumann together with Stanislaw Ulam, both mathematicians, in 1958 and later explored and expanded by Werner Winge and Ray Kurzweil. According to Winge, the technological singularity would be a huge explosion in artificial intelligence that would occur at some point in the coming decades. In this case, he was writing this in the 1990s. So this acceleration of the technological process would be the central characteristic of the 20th and 21st centuries, and these changes would lead to the creation of a new technological entity with intellectual capacity even greater than human intelligence. Furthermore, this possible singularity could lead to the emergence of an entity with superhuman intelligence in the following years, which he thought would be between 2005 and 2030, resulting in the rise of machines and, consequently, the end of the human era. Anders Sandberg, a physicist. Based on this, he determined that there would be 9 meanings for the term technological singularity, which in turn could be summarized into 3 main aspects: accelerated change, prediction horizon, and intelligence explosion. Thus, a singularity would be like a break in our ability to predict what comes next because our standard everyday tools, our current technology, would become inadequate to understand what comes after this event. So what we would have is the creation of these intelligent machines that would have enough cognitive abilities to rival or even surpass those of humanity. Furthermore, these machines would be capable of recursive self-improvement. In other words, they would redesign themselves to be more advanced. In other words, to further illustrate this, it would be like a machine developing an even better machine than itself. Then, this other machine would be able to develop a third machine better than itself, which in turn could develop a fourth machine even better than itself. In other words, this artificial intelligence would be able to develop a machine superior to the previous generation with each new generation, and as a result, this would create an intelligence explosion that would eventually surpass human intelligence. This exponential ability to improve itself through more redesigns would eventually lead to an intelligence explosion, and artificial intelligence machines would reach levels of intelligence that would be beyond human understanding and consequently outside of our control. And here's something important, because only the generation of people who would be living through this intelligence explosion would be able to understand the technological singularity. That is, the generation that experiences this phenomenon and the generations that come after would be the only generations capable of understanding this process. Therefore, previous generations would not be able to fully understand this technological concept. It would be as if, by going back in time, you explain this technology to someone who is not experiencing this explosion of intelligence and explained it to them. They simply would not be able to understand what you are saying. Only the generations that have seen this and from then on will be able to understand. Which leads us to a problem, because most of the academics who write about this concept of technological singularities are usually trying to predict and explain the next big technological change. But if they predict what the next one will be, then that big change couldn't, as a consequence, be that singularity. Furthermore, even though all the analyses consider this concept as being related or limited to artificial intelligence, there are characteristics and elements that are much broader and can help explain technological development throughout human history. Especially because all predictions related to the next technological singularity so far have failed. So, it is possible to say that the concept of technological singularity has 4 characteristics. First, it is a type of knowledge acquisition that causes enormous changes in technological development, triggering a series of other acquired knowledge, then leading to this explosion of intelligence. For Kurzweil, this singularity of intelligence means that an ultra-intelligent machine would be able to design machines even better than itself, and at a certain point would surpass all the intellectual activities of humanity combined, resulting in something he defined as an explosion of intelligence. This would make supercomputers compete with the capacity of the human brain by the end of this decade. Remember that he wrote this in 2005, so he thought this explosion would happen around 2020. This exponential growth of computing compared to the human brain is demonstrated in this graph. Second, this would be a point where our old models must be discarded and a new reality takes over, meaning technology changes the human perception of the universe and humanity's interactions change with the environment and within social relationships. And third, as already mentioned, only the generation and the following generations who witness this technological achievement are able to fully understand this technology. And finally, and I believe this is by far the most important point, the technological singularity involves a point of no return, which can be interpreted as knowledge that cannot be lost once it has been acquired. Therefore, by considering these 4 aspects as the main characteristics of the technological singularity, I realize that it is possible to look back in human history and isolate 4 advances that triggered similar reactions worthy of being considered the equivalent of the technological singularities of their time. In other words, there is a rare, very rare technological pattern similar to this future singularity. And the reason for this is that the concept these physicists and mathematicians created was based on certain characteristics that serve as a methodology. I don't think they realized this, but it's still interesting how, in the end, this ended up happening. Because if you apply these characteristics they used in computing and artificial intelligence to a historical and sociological perspective, we'll notice that there are patterns. So, there are 4 past events that can be considered technological singularities because they have the same characteristics they mentioned: a substantial increase in intelligence, a point of discontinuity in relation to old models, the point where only the generations that witness such an event are able to fully understand it, and the accelerated progress of technologies from that moment on, with changes in the way humans live. And fifth, a point of no return. In other words, you can't simply forget or unlearn that technology. In general, these events or key technologies not only resulted in an explosion of intelligence, but also triggered other derivative technologies in a relatively short period of time. In addition, these key technologies also have another characteristic, which is the population explosion. You can see that the world population grows slowly or remains relatively stable for a certain period of time until these technologies are reached, and then there is a rapid explosion in world population growth, which then stabilizes or goes back to growing very slowly until the next key technology arrives, or what I call a technological singularity, where this process repeats itself. So, get ready, because we are just beginning a long journey ahead. A journey that will last millions of years, starting with cavemen, reaching up to the present day, and speculating about what the future of humanity and technology will be. But don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell to stay up to date with all the channel's news. And also consider sharing the video with everyone you know. Your help is extremely important so I can keep bringing you content about geopolitics and history. My name is Adelian Peta, and this is World Geopolitics. This journey starts here with the manipulation and control of energy. After all, energy is life. If there's one thing observable in all known forms of life, it's the search for and conversion of energy. So obviously, the rational use and controlled manipulation of energy to sustain life would be a distinguishing factor of an intelligent species compared to other species. And this control is the first step, the dividing line, to form what we can call a civilization. But after all, what is civilization? Civilization is a complex society that is characterized by the development of a political state, social stratification, urbanization, and symbolic systems of communication beyond spoken natural language. Historically, a civilization can be understood as a larger and more advanced culture in contrast to smaller cultures that are supposedly less advanced. Thus, a civilization contrasts with non-centralized tribal societies, including the cultures of nomadic herders, Neolithic societies, or hunter-gatherers. The idea of what is or isn't civilized is controversial and not always simple. But how can an animal that is still in its early stage of intelligence, not even at the top of the food chain, cross the line between just being a very intelligent animal and finally moving toward the establishment of a future civilization? After all, dolphins and monkeys have an extremely sophisticated level of intelligence. Their groups are hierarchical, and their way of communication allows for the transmission of complex information. Or even ants, which in addition to having extremely complex and hierarchical collectives, also have well-divided and defined roles, and are capable of extremely elaborate and developed engineering works, but none of them have managed to establish an organization that we can call a civilization. And for that, first we need to know exactly what intelligence is. Spearman, who was a psychologist from the early 20th century and whose research has been revalidated in recent years, says that intelligence can be understood as a general factor, which is present in all our intellectual abilities. He called this general factor G. It's like a kind of ingredient that's present in the things we do that involve our mind. It's as if all abilities like solving problems, learning new things, or understanding complex information have something in common, a point where they all connect, and that point is the G factor. So, according to him, intelligence is like an ingredient that influences all our mental abilities and is like the foundation of everything we do with our mind. Of course, each person has their own specific abilities, but the G factor is present in all of them, bringing everything together. So this would be intelligence. Which raises the question, how does an animal cross that boundary of intelligence and establish the foundation of a society complex enough to become a civilization? And when we look at our history, we see a well-defined dividing line, a first step that finally separates humans from animals, the first boundary to be crossed for the human being that will mark the beginning of our evolutionary race, which is the control and manipulation of natural elements, and in our case, not just any element, but the element of fire. The element of fire is often associated with something mystical. Culturally, it has a very strong symbolism in almost every culture, whether as a symbol of creation, destruction, or even rebirth. The importance of fire is well established in many ancient civilizations and even in modern ones. And the discovery of fire marks a turning point in human history. The image and warmth of fire penetrate the soul and evoke something magical. And it's no wonder, after all, the most diverse cultures have always attributed an almost religious value to fire. The discovery of fire is often associated with some kind of conquest or a divine gift. In ancient China, fire is presented in the legend of Shi, a hero, a mythological demigod who ventured into a forest in the far west of China where there was a tree that shone during the day, and at night, Shi noticed that when woodpeckers pecked at that tree, sparks would fly, lighting up the tree. He then decided to break off two branches and struck one stick against the other in quick succession. Eventually, he managed to get the sticks to ignite and create fire. When he returned to his home province, he taught people how to light fires to keep warm. Furthermore, until then people ate raw meat and vegetables and would get sick, but now with fire, they learned to cook their food before eating, greatly reducing illnesses caused by eating raw food. On the other side of the world, in ancient and mythological Greece, fire is connected to the story of Prometheus, a titan god who defied the gods by stealing fire from them and giving it to humanity in the form of technology. Thanks to this gift, people were able to form civilization. Such a powerful gift enraged the gods of Olympus, who condemned Prometheus to eternal torment for his transgression. Prometheus was tied to a rock and an eagle was sent to eat his liver, which would grow back during the night only to be eaten again the next day in a continuous and endless cycle. And in the book of Enoch, an ancestor of Noah, fire is connected to the fallen angel Azazel, who teaches men to make tools like swords, knives, and shields. Agni, the Hindu god of fire, represents the essential energy of life in the universe. He consumes things, but only so that other things can live. Native American tribes also believe that long ago, some evil hid fire so that people could not benefit from it. Then a hero managed to recover the fire and give it to humans. In African stories, fire was a gift given to humans by animals, and some indigenous tribes in the Amazon region say that a jaguar rescued a boy and took him to its cave. There, the boy watched the jaguar cook food over the fire and stole a hot coal from the fire, taking it back to his people, who then learned how to cook. In other words, in many different cultures, fire is often portrayed as a skill restricted to the gods or some mythological entity, being either a sacred gift or a theft carried out by a legendary character, and after its acquisition, it drastically changes the lives of human beings, and in each case and story, this event becomes a turning point, the impulse for human development. Fire is the rapid oxidation of a material that serves as fuel, which then releases heat, light, and various reaction products. Although fire is a natural chemical reaction, it is a challenge to establish precise data about the use of fire as an artifact. There is clear and varied evidence of ancient uses of controlled fires, in contrast to natural fires that were contained and maintained. However, it is generally reasonable to assume that this development occurred sometime between 1 million and 700,000 years ago, and its habitual use would have started only between 300,000 and 400,000 years ago. While some scholars, such as Bruce G. Trigger from the Department of Anthropology at McGill University, considered the development of writing to be the distinction between civilization and barbarism, it would be more accurate to consider the controlled manipulation of nature, fire in this case, as the trigger that initiated the concept of civilization. Ultimately, this ability gave humans control over their destiny and finally separated humans from their predecessors as well as from other animals. For researchers Thomas David Barrett and Robin Dunbar from the Department of Experimental Psychology at the University of Oxford, in a study on hair loss in human evolution, the development of controlled fire drastically changed the course of human evolution, triggering chain reactions in man's relationship with nature, his social organization, and surprisingly, even his biology. Because of the use of fire, the first hominids were able to use caves as a regular base, and individuals who were not covered in hair could neutralize the loss of body heat. Until then, the loss of body heat was problematic in open fields. Besides protection against the cold, fire allowed for radical changes in human biology and in humanity's relationship with the balance of nature. Before the use of fire, humans were easy prey for large predators, especially at night. However, with the use of fire, man gained a tool that could be used as protection against predators, permanently establishing man at the top of the food chain. A simple animal without big muscles, claws, fangs, venom, or any other natural defense mechanism was now simply able to drive away predators and even hunt them. According to Richard Rangan, anthropologist and primatologist from Harvard University, regarding biological effects, fire also made it possible to cook food, which changed human digestion and increased protein absorption. In turn, as meat consumption increased, humans gained more energy, which influenced the reproduction rate and likely enhanced brain growth. This change is explained by improvements in cooking techniques, which likely increased human intelligence. Furthermore, it's fair to assume that because of cooking, humans were able to adapt to a wider variety of diets in different regions. Local cuisines were developed to improve different types of food, which helped humanity successfully spread across the globe. Furthermore, fire clearly changed sociocultural aspects by triggering various other technologies. With fire and cooking, early humans were able to develop pottery to store food efficiently, which opened the doors to the concept of manipulating other elements, and eventually to metallurgy several thousand years later, around 4,000 years before Christ. This technology, in turn, allowed humans to manipulate metals to create desired shapes, which until then was impossible or extremely difficult because hammering was the only option. With the knowledge of heating by fire, metals could then be softened and manipulated. The knowledge of fire and its use in controlling and manipulating natural elements fulfills all the defining characteristics of a technological singularity. In fact, this was the first technological singularity, because it allowed the human species to reconfigure its environment and unconsciously alter its own biology. This technology not only triggered several other technologies, but also caused an explosion of intelligence due to its effects on human anatomy. Fire also changed humans' interaction with nature, as well as their perception of the universe. In fact, this technology was responsible for allowing humans to develop sapience, that is, to recognize their own existence, introducing an entirely new perception of reality. Furthermore, the mastery of fire was restricted to the hominids who witnessed it and developed it afterward, since it was not possible for previous generations to fully understand and control it. And another important thing is that the manipulation of fire was a point of no return. This technology has a reach that goes beyond the global, having become such an essential concept for humans that its existence became a fundamental part of humanity, and the loss of this technology is literally impossible. But if fire was the first step to stabilizing what we could call civilization, then what will actually lay the foundation for it? And the answer will be the next technological singularity, as important as the first one, fire, which will also revolutionize human evolution and its relationship with the planet and open space for new interpretations of reality. The second technological singularity, yes, is the mass production of energy in a controlled way, also known as agriculture. When we talk about energy, the first thing many people tend to think of is advanced nuclear power plants or complex oil refineries. But no, energy is not just the fuel we use in our cars or in our industries, or the electricity to power the electronic devices we use every day. We humans also directly consume energy, especially through food. So the first form of controlled energy production was through agriculture and livestock. However, the word energy refers not only to the energy needed to sustain life through food and agriculture, but also to the human ability to develop large-scale energy sources for various uses. This reference to energy involves a broader terminology that even includes industrial cases. For example, in the last century, ethanol extraction was used for production, lighting, and logistical purposes. For Professor Dr. Ernesto Paterniani, who was the director of the Institute of Genetics and an international leader in the study of variability and genetic improvement of corn, the survival and success of human beings were only possible due to agricultural techniques developed approximately 10,000 years ago. Specifically, before the development of agriculture, nomadic humans were focused on hunting and gathering the food provided by nature. Professor Paterniani also cited as an example of the profound and radical change brought by agriculture the fact that before it the area needed to provide food for long periods for a single individual was approximately 2,500 hectares or 25 square kilometers of land. Whereas, after the development of agricultural techniques, only 250 hectares or 2.5 square kilometers were needed. Were already enough to feed 3,600 people. The impact of agricultural development caused a drastic change in human organization, reducing nomadism and causing a population explosion. This is a characteristic of all singularities. Even with the ability to primitively control the elements, humans remained very vulnerable to the challenges imposed by nature because groups of nomadic hunters lived in smaller communities. Extended families of nomadic groups were usually made up of no more than 50 people. Agrarian communities, however, required a larger workforce to work in the fields. In addition, non-nomadic groups that produced their own sources of energy were much less vulnerable to food shortages and environmental changes that affected the supply of food available in nature. Occasional decreases in the food supply directly caused a drop in birth rates and an increase in mortality rates in nomadic groups much more than in sedentary groups. Furthermore, in some cultures, the development of seeds that could be fermented likely constituted the earliest forms of medicine to prevent diseases. Dr. Thomas Sinclair from the Department of Crop Physiology and Ecology at North Carolina State University explains that thanks to grains that were fermented, early humans began to manipulate alcohol, using this substance in water as a way to prevent diseases. Because the process of heating water when preparing grains and producing alcohol through fermentation was a way to make the water relatively safe for consumption, a fact that drastically reduced the number of diseases caused by parasites and other organisms in ancient populations. And similar to fire, agriculture and livestock had biological impacts on the human body, also being responsible for shaping the human immune system by exposing it to new diseases, since most diseases today are somehow related to some level of animal domestication as sources or vectors. In other words, by domesticating a number of animals, we became more exposed to a series of other organisms that were previously unknown to humans, but less lethal, which in a way boosted our immune capacity. Many infectious diseases today or in the recent past are the result of exposure to animal excrement or contact with pest species such as rodents. This contact became more frequent precisely because of agriculture, urbanization, and a sedentary lifestyle. In addition, human red blood cells have changed to provide resistance to malaria in some individuals. For researcher Sandra Wilde from the Institute of Anthropology at Johannes Gutenberg Men's University, the light color of hair, eyes, and skin in the European population was the result of a diet poor in vitamin D. This deficiency was caused by the shift from a hunter-gatherer diet, which was rich in vitamin D, to an agricultural diet that was poor in vitamin D. However, the greatest impact related to agricultural development was behavioral. As a requirement for cultivating the land, the first human societies were pushed toward a settled life, which led to the development of a more complex political structure based on hierarchical food production. The increase in stored food allowed parts of the first societies to work in different areas that were not related to food harvesting. In other words, thanks to agricultural production, there were now more people available to work on things that were not related to food production. Instead of remaining limited to this production, and as a result, society gradually split into several new types of professions. Furthermore, through this technology, humans were able to expand their influence over their environment and use other sources of energy, such as domesticated animals. In particular, large mammals that can be used as a source of protein-rich food, as well as providing pulling power on farms, and later serving as a means of transportation and consequently in hunting and of course in war. And one of the most impressive things is that the technology of agriculture and animal husbandry also allowed humans to directly influence the biological and evolutionary aspects of plants and animals through artificial selection. Robert Shelley Kelly, professor of anthropology and coordinator of the archaeology program at the University of Wyoming, points out that agriculture was actually the result of many factors and therefore something excessively complex. For him, agriculture consisted of different strategies at different times and in different places, involving the intentional use of plants that could be directed toward various objectives. And the achievement in agriculture would not have been possible without a certain degree of extremely complex intelligence. In other words, this was only possible due to changes in the human brain that increased intelligence and made humans capable of understanding and applying complex tasks in different contexts, which was only possible in turn thanks to the physiological changes triggered by the knowledge acquired with fire, as we have already explained earlier. But more than that, thanks to this ability to manipulate the evolutionary chain of plants and animals, we, in the last thousands of years, have manipulated some species so much that they would be practically unrecognizable from their natural ancestors. An example of this can be seen in our main companions for thousands of years, dogs. A study conducted at Duquesne University in the United States showed that dogs have a facial muscle that allows them to raise their eyebrows to change their facial expression according to the feeling the animal wants to convey. However, this muscle only appeared as a result of the animal's evolution. Since their ancestors like the wolf do not have such a muscle, domestic dogs developed this muscular ability to reproduce facial expressions just like their human owners. The results also showed that dogs raise their eyebrows even more when they are near a human. In other words, we humans were able to biologically alter dogs so that they developed a type of facial muscle that did not exist in their natural form. And not just with dogs, we've done this with horses, cattle, chickens, cats, birds, and many other animals. In some cases, unfortunately, even in a harmful way due to excessive selective breeding. The Dachshund dog breeds, popularly known as sausage dogs, have had their long backs stretched too much, which has increasingly raised the chances of developing spinal diseases, especially degenerative disc diseases. The same happens with bulldogs as well. The excessive breeding of this same breed without genetic variety has made the current bulldog quite different from what it was 100 years ago. This has led to more and more respiratory diseases appearing in this breed, with some scientists even calling it involution. And not just with animals, but we've also done this repeatedly with plants, which over thousands and thousands of years, first through seed selection and more recently through genetic manipulation in laboratories, have made certain crops become vastly different from their original forms. Bananas, peaches, watermelons, and other fruits as well as corn, wheat, and other grains are nothing like what our ancestors in ancient times used to eat. In 4,000 years before Christ, for example, there were only 3 varieties of peach. Today, there are more than 200, increasing their average size from 2.5 centimeters, of which only 60% were edible, to 10 centimeters, of which 90% are edible. Watermelons, which originated in Namibia, were only 5 centimeters in size 3,000 years before Christ, nothing like the huge watermelons that weigh several kilos today. Imagine showing a noble from the 18th century the bananas we have today, considering that when he ate bananas, they were not only thin and small, but also had seeds. The second technological singularity, the one of agriculture and livestock, is the first singularity that literally made humans leave fingerprints on the planet. Not only allowing humans to permanently alter the evolution of plants and animals, but also leaving on the face of the earth the first marks visible from space. With this singularity, our presence could no longer go unnoticed, even from far away. The human being, a sneaky animal that was in the middle of the food chain, in just a few thousand years, not only reached the top, but was now also able to decide the evolutionary fate of animals and plants. However, a problem remained. When the ancestors die, much of their knowledge is lost. Oral transmission from person to person isn't reliable, just look at the game of telephone. Oral transmission, besides losing data and information, sometimes distorts or even changes them. And because of that, human technological evolution moved at a slow pace, since with each generation, a lot of ancient knowledge had to be recovered through practical experience, only to often be lost again when people died. In short, we can't talk to the dead to get their knowledge back, and we also didn't have efficient ways to transmit knowledge over long distances, or do we? What if I told you that yes, we can talk to the dead to acquire their experience and not lose it anymore? And this is where the next technological singularity comes in, the third one. Throughout history, many peoples have maintained their traditions, culture, and laws through the spoken word. Maintaining cultures orally has been a characteristic that has been reasonably sufficient to preserve such cultural heritage. However, oral tradition fails to store complex data and information. Just the voice is not enough to transmit and spread knowledge. As a result, humans needed to develop a more efficient way to preserve knowledge, expand it to more areas, and spread it to more people. And the way to do this was the third technological singularity, which is the storage and transfer of knowledge to future generations, also known as writing. Imagine if you could talk to scientists from the 18th century, magnates from the 19th century, with religious figures from the Middle Ages. And no, we're not talking about some magical way or summoning spirits, we're talking about writing. The most efficient way humans have developed to preserve their knowledge and transmit it beyond time and space. The importance of storing and transmitting data accurately to different individuals and groups in different places and times should be considered another technological singularity represented by the development of writing. It's important to note that this does not include proto-writing symbols due to their lack of precision, which is a main characteristic of writing. After all, this technological singularity refers to a complex writing system capable of transmitting the desired information in a fully precise way. Whether this technological achievement was accidental or consciously made, the development of writing was extremely necessary to organize the social structures of the increasingly larger human settlements, which were becoming increasingly complex and divided. Now we're talking about villages and cities with hundreds, thousands, and even several tens of thousands of people. Public administration, whether for legal or even commercial purposes, could no longer be done with just verbal rules. Managing inventories and designing complex constructions also could no longer rely solely on memory and imagination. It was essential for this to be recorded and transmitted. Specifically for accounting, writing became necessary to record ownership and information about the storage of goods, which eventually gave rise to the foundation of today's economy. In addition, writing was used to efficiently organize resources on a universal scale, and to permanently record necessary information such as numbers, item counts, people involved, schedules and locations, and to avoid losing them due to an oral record-keeping system that could obviously forget, distort, or confuse the information. The information was first recorded about these goods and then about religious information such as prayers and incantations. The first civilizations built libraries to be used in the education of scribes who were initially focused on religion, but later expanded to formal scientific knowledge such as botany, zoology, mineralogy, and mathematics. In general, it is fair to say that these writings and libraries, except in cases of wars in which they were destroyed, were the most efficient way to pass information to different groups on a large scale, if not the only one, including today's digital libraries. Another important impact of the development of writing was the bureaucratization of society and the regulation of property and social institutions, including marriage and legal codes to standardize punishments and rights, such as the Code of Hammurabi. While the second singularity of agricultural knowledge established clear divisions in society by giving people from different castes varying access to the means of production, the development of writing would then expand this division to increasingly larger and more complex urban and hierarchical structures, while administrative efficiency increased their control over society. Thus, society, while still fully composed of illiterates, was limited in number and also had its capacity for collective action restricted. However, literate societies, even if not everyone was literate, practically had no limits to their population and had the ability to coordinate efforts under centralized and organized command, a fact that, just like the previous singularities, would once again drive another population explosion. The development of writing not only helped primitive societies create social and economic patterns, but also increased humans' ability to influence their environment, leading to an entirely new vision and understanding of the universe through advanced mathematics and numerical writing. The use of a sophisticated system for writing numbers and the development of equations and numerical systems was a huge technological revolution at the time. Mathematics was only possible thanks to writing, and it would simply change the relationship between humans and the universe. For the first time, humanity would conduct research beyond its current location and extend scientific observation to the stars with astronomy, expanding the understanding of humanity's place in relation to the universe. It is reasonable to connect this revolution to the development of engineering everywhere. After all, complex engineering was only possible thanks to mathematics, which ended up increasing humanity's ability to influence nature and the planet. On some levels, engineering even led to what can be interpreted as an early form of terraforming. Or in other words, writing would open up a range of new knowledge, which would allow humans in the following millennia, which is nothing on a geological scale, to manipulate the planet, gradually altering it to meet human needs. The trajectory of humanity from its first technological singularity to climbing the food chain and then gradually becoming able to reshape the earth to a point of no return is shown through primitive examples. In 2000 years before Christ, the Yellow River in China was tamed by the Chinese through the construction of canals and dikes, which often cause floods and destruction in the region. We are literally talking about ancestral human beings using their intelligence to control the forces of nature. Likewise, even during the Roman Empire, there was already the ability to alter the flow of rivers. The power of writing, of storing data and information in a theoretically eternal way, made it easier to transmit knowledge. Now the death of a person no longer meant losing the knowledge that person possessed. It became possible for humans to accumulate information at levels never seen before, which would increase the power to acquire even more information, generating even more knowledge in a positive cycle. With more knowledge stored and spread, more complex and specialized populations began to emerge. There was no longer a limit to how far humans could go, but there was still another singularity, the last known one that would truly give us dominion over the planet and even push us beyond it. The fourth singularity is called a revolution because that's literally what it was, a revolution. The Industrial Revolution, or large-scale automation of labor, began in Great Britain at the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century. It can be considered the fourth and last technological singularity due to its enormous social and scientific impact on humanity. It fulfills all four aspects of a singularity. Furthermore, we are still living under its influence. And we will probably remain this way for a long time because its existence is still evolving. The best way to understand how machines and industrial automation can be considered a singularity and why humans are still influenced by it is to explore the impact of this achievement. The famous English historian Eric Hobsbawm explains that the Industrial Revolution shook society by drastically changing productivity both quantitatively and qualitatively without requiring great technical sophistication. Machinery unleashed a huge chain of events in the fields of political science and economics. In fact, this event deepened the interactions between different societies around the world, increasing the exchange of products, people, and knowledge on a scale never seen before. For example, the changes during the 19th century were so rapid that the events documented in Around the World in 80 Days by the writer Julio Verne were possible when it was published in 1873. However, just 2 or 3 decades earlier, that same adventure would have been not only impossible, but pure fiction or even a utopia. In fact, the same trip just 30 years earlier would have taken about a year instead of 80 days, especially without the huge expansion of railways outside of Great Britain. In 1840, Europe had, for example, 1,700 miles of railway and North America had 2,800 miles of railway. But by 1880, just 40 years later, those numbers had risen to 101.7 thousand miles of railways in Europe and 100.6 thousand miles in North America, with the added factor of increased locomotive speeds. Another type of technology that was achieved because of the technological explosion started by the Industrial Revolution was long-distance communication. It began with the telegram, which reduced the time to send and receive messages from months to just a few minutes. During the first half of the 19th century, it would have been unthinkable for a message from the other side of the planet to cover that distance in just a few minutes. But by the second half of the same century, this had become common. This rapid development in communications and logistics also led to unprecedented levels of immigration. For example, in the United States, California saw its population of nearly 100,000 people in 1849 explode to 250,000 people in. The Industrial Revolution would not only shrink the size of the world, but again, just like fire, it would change our biological structure. Thanks to technologies derived from the Industrial Revolution, such as overproduction of food, storage methods, advances in the chemical and pharmaceutical industries, and new medical knowledge, humans would now live longer than ever before. In cities like London, at the beginning of the 1840s, life expectancy was about 36 years. Life expectancy in Manchester was 25 years. And in Glasgow it was 27 years, while in the rural areas of England it was about 45 years. The situation was worsened by the fact that infant mortality rates may have reached 348 per thousand inhabitants. However, in the 19th century, the number of human development services increased and the mortality rate decreased due to the impact of the agricultural, industrial, and sanitary revolutions. Deaths related to environmental infectious diseases caused by water and food sources, childhood infections, and pulmonary tuberculosis decreased first, reducing mortality, especially among the young. And in fact, scientific fields such as medicine and pharmacology, as well as all other natural and human sciences, experienced a great leap during the 19th century. The average person in 1800 was much more different from the average person in 1899 than the differences between the average person in 1800 and the average person in 1500. Some people like Jules Verne or Herbert George Wells were able to imagine technologies that would only be achieved in the next century or even in the 21st century. The impacts of automation today follow the same patterns as fire and agriculture, altering human biology and intentionally enhancing it. In fact, the range of discoveries that began with the explosion of knowledge originating in the 19th century would, 2 centuries later, result in the human being's ability to begin genetic manipulation of themselves. As recently came to light, it was discovered that China has been researching human genetics to determine which genes make people more intelligent. Their scientists collected DNA samples from 2,000 people around the world who are considered highly intelligent to explore the entire genome in an attempt to identify the alleles that determine human intelligence. This embryo screening will allow parents in the future to choose their brightest zygote and thus increase the intelligence of each generation. 5 to 15 intelligence quotient points, and part of this innovation has already come to light when a Chinese scientist from the Southern University of Science and Technology, He Jiankui, made public his genetic manipulation of embryos that resulted in babies immune to the acquired immune deficiency syndrome virus, and several universities and research centers around the world are making enormous progress every day. Other interventions aim for more direct improvements, such as the development of artificial muscles with carbon nanotubes to increase athletic performance, or nanoparticles that attach to red blood cells to improve drug delivery. In general, it is possible to say that these improvements will ultimately end up changing the human species itself, especially if the enhancement of nanoparticle-based gene transfer technology develops enough to alter the genetic code of human beings sufficiently. It is also possible to establish, as a consequence of the fourth singularity, an increasing human-machine interaction such as exoskeletons, which are nothing more than devices attached to the bodies of human beings, making them capable of increasing their strength and human capacity in their movements. In addition to following a pattern similar to previous technological singularities, the Industrial Revolution increased the average human intelligence to levels that had not been seen in previous centuries. If previously the progress of human intelligence was generally slower, the rapid and incredible advances during and after the 19th century changed human perceptions of the universe. This singularity caused, in less than 200 years, humans to move from wind-powered naval transportation to developing transportation mechanisms so efficient that they managed to put people on the moon. Basically, it took us thousands of years to go from this to just this. less than 200 years to go from this to get here. People in general think that today is the era of science and scientific evolution. But no. Actually, that era was the 19th century. The 20th and 21st centuries are actually the materialization of the imagination of the 19th century. This singularity, at the same time, became a point of no return because now it's practically impossible to think that the knowledge of machines and industrial automation could ever become lost knowledge. Even with some great catastrophe, we have mastered the most basic and elementary principles to restart automation from scratch if necessary. Furthermore, only the generations that experienced the changes during the 19th century and those that came after would be able to understand these new models of society, economy, perception of the universe, and reality. Thus, we realize that based on various patterns, it is not difficult to understand why these four specific events can and should be considered technological singularities, while other technologies, despite their significance, did not reach the same level of importance. These four technologies served as a foundation and triggered chain reactions that opened doors for the development of other technologies for millennia and centuries afterward. No achievement in metallurgy or chemistry would have been possible without the basic mastery of fire and the knowledge of natural elements. Agriculture was one of the first forms of controlled energy production and remains one of the main sources of the world economy, providing food and water for other energy sources for various purposes, such as ethanol, for example. It is impossible to imagine the construction of long bridges or tall buildings without the development of writing. Furthermore, information would be lost at high rates if it continued to be transmitted only orally. And still, all nuclear technology, robotics, and the internet are directly derived from the expansion of machines during the Industrial Revolution. Any of these achievements would have been impossible or even unthinkable before the revolution. Of course, all technologies eventually lead to other technologies, but only these four are breakthroughs that created a huge variety of other technologies for which these singularities are their shared foundation. Another pattern related to singularities is the requirement to reach a point where our old models must be discarded and a new reality prevails. Each of these four achievements changed the way humans saw themselves and their role in their environment and in the universe. By subtly changing human biology in the long term or creating new ways to understand advanced mathematics and consequently astronomy and philosophy, these technologies gradually and promptly broke old views and models. Most of these previous views and models failed to incorporate new discoveries that would have changed the organization of society and forced the abandonment of outdated models. In the face of these drastic changes and complexities, the four singularities that we showed could only be fully understood by the generations that witnessed these revolutions and those that came after. Furthermore, each of these four singularities increased the intelligence of society during its development. Of course, there are some exceptions, like the Greek inventor Ctesibios, who preceded the mechanical revolution by centuries. However, his knowledge was far ahead of his time and, more importantly, it did not spread or remain as a scientific foundation. The next pattern, the point of no return, involves the impossibility of domains like fire, agriculture, writing, or machinery ever becoming lost knowledge. Besides that, they were universal technologies, even when applied to peoples who did not have contact with other groups. While some very important technologies were not shared between different civilizations and therefore cannot be considered technological singularities, such as the wheel, which was not used by pre-Columbian societies despite its importance. This is because singularities can be considered a kind of sociological and anthropological requirement, meaning that all civilizations will need to go through each one to reach the next singularity, and these are events shared by different societies even without contact between them. For example, Writing originated in different and independent regions of the world. In other words, it is not possible to return to the point before the emergence of this technological singularity because it spread so widely across the planet and became so deeply rooted in the foundation of human existence. Now, another pattern among singularities is the population explosion that follows their discovery. It's difficult to calculate the human population during the pre-Paleolithic and Paleolithic ages, as these estimates are mainly based on skeletal remains and the characteristics of inhabited sites. According to Jean-Noël Birabin from the French National Institute for Demographic Studies, the world human population among the first humans was around 100,000 individuals, which grew dramatically between 300,000 and 200,000 years before Christ to between 500,000 and 700,000 individuals, still as Homo erectus, and later became 800,000 already as Homo sapiens. But here's an important factor. This period of time involves the evolution of human biology and a population explosion that occurred during the earliest mastery of fire, which we have already described as the first singularity. Eventually, this population peaked at 1.5 million individuals between 50,000 and 40,000 years before Christ. But another population explosion would still occur during the Neolithic, roughly between 10,000 and 4,500 years before Christ, when the population of 1.5 million grew to at least 10 million people. A period that coincided with the development of agriculture, the second singularity. Interestingly, a third population explosion followed immediately after another singularity, writing from 4,500 years before Christ to the 1st century after Christ. The population went from approximately 10 million humans to 250 million with consistent growth, then remained moderately stable with a few declines caused by plagues and wars until 1800. When the fourth singularity, the Industrial Revolution, reaches its peak. For the first time, the human population surpassed the 1 billion mark, and just 200 years later it reached more than 6 billion people, which in the following 20 years would reach 8 billion. As I explained earlier, the singularities boosted human intelligence and at the same time increased the human population. For this reason, and because of the four main characteristics described, only these four technological achievements can be considered technological singularities. With that, we could end our journey here. But there's still one more thing. The concept of technological singularity, while it can be used anthropologically to explain technologies and important points from the past, was not originally developed for that purpose. It's worth remembering that the focus was on the next explosion of intelligence caused by machines, which brings us to the final question. And what about the myth of the next singularity? Will we see the next technological singularity soon? It's important to note that each technological singularity that was reached had an interval of thousands of years before the next one. If we reach the next singularity in the coming decades, that would be something exceptional, because we would be talking about a few hundred years. But it's worth remembering that the concept was ironically created to predict the next singularity when machines would surpass human intelligence and maybe even rebel against humans. Kurzweil calculated that at some point in the early 21st century, a new singularity would occur through the enhancement of artificial intelligence, and machines would surpass humans using recent technologies with global impacts, like the internet. However, not only can this hypothesis be denied, but it's possible to suppose that the internet, artificial intelligence, and many other technologies are actually the result of the last singularity, large-scale automation. Or, in other words, the next technological singularity wouldn't be so imminent because it has already happened. After all, for each recent achievement, the four characteristics that need to be met to constitute a technological singularity and the population explosion that follows it were only found in the Industrial Revolution and in no other technology since. And if we take a strictly focused approach on these key aspects, we see that new technologies like artificial intelligence, robotics, the internet, etc., would be nothing more than variations or even derivations of the large-scale automations of the technologies that originated in the Industrial Revolution. Despite the mistake by Kurzweil and Winch in questionably using this concept of technological singularity as a way to try to predict the rise of machines, they actually helped to create a basic idea and a methodology based on 4 characteristics that can explain the progress of civilization, and their work should be used to define clear patterns in technological evolution. But more than that, their work could even be used as a paradigm for future observations. If this concept becomes universally fundamental, it would not be unthinkable for it to also help in the search for civilizations in outer space. After all, other civilizations would eventually also have to go through the process of controlling natural elements, producing energy in an organized and controlled way, efficiently storing and transmitting knowledge, and also multiplying their workforce in an automated way. It may just be that the means other civilizations use are different from fire, agriculture, writing, and machines, things we don't know yet or can't even imagine. And if it's a civilization more advanced than ours, maybe they've already developed one or more singularities beyond what we have. As absurd as this idea may seem, scientists take it seriously and believe that the most efficient way to find extraterrestrial life is actually by looking for technological imprints and signatures left by them. Instead of a threat from a superintelligent artificial intelligence against humans, it's possible to imagine that, in fact, the last singularity we develop will change humans on such a large scale that our biology and intelligence will improve greatly. And possibly, they might even merge with the human body and machines as imagined in cyberpunk science fiction. In other words, within this idea, far from seeing a rise of machines that will try to destroy us, we should imagine the possibility that in the future we will merge with them. A concept known as transhumanism. If this is true, instead of fearing the future, we should embrace it because the potential is enormous, and we're just at the beginning of a journey that will last many millions of years. We humans would not be in our last days. On the contrary, we would just be at the beginning of a journey toward the universe. But considering all the context around future technologies and the potential involving the next technological singularity, we will end up heading in a direction full of speculation. We don't know what tomorrow holds, let alone the next decades, centuries, or millennia. So, besides greatly thanking all of you for your support by staying with me here on the World Geopolitics channel, I want to announce the next channel where I will work with scientific, speculative, and science fiction topics. The channel Futuristic Horizons, and I will leave the link in the highlighted comments. Because geopolitics is an ultra-realist science, and there isn't much room for speculation, especially regarding the future of science, which is something I will leave to be done on this new channel, where I also hope to have your support. Thank you to all the subscribers. Without your help, I wouldn't have reached 50,000 subscribers, and I wouldn't even think about creating a second channel. You can't even imagine how important you were for me to get this far. You encouraged me a lot, and I can only thank you for your support. Especially to the members who literally carried the channel on their backs by kindly funding my work. I honestly hope that I can keep giving back. With quality, the affection, support, and encouragement you give me every time I release a new video. Thank you and see you later.